All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Jansen. I will not be having video today, but I'm sure you may have seen me in past online presentations or in-person meetings when Allan and I have conducted them in the past. This is our final installment of Land Management Quarterly, and this is brought to you by the Center for Ag Profitability, which is stationed here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And the resources that we're talking about today, we will be posting the slides as well as the recording, and that can be found at the website and the link noted in the lower right-hand side of your device that you're viewing this presentation on. It's cap.unl.edu/land management. As I said before, my name is Jim Jansen. I'm an agricultural economist here at the University of Nebraska. And we have Allan Vyhnalek, who's also joining us. He's our expert in farm succession, transition, and related farm management and communication issues. We can be reached, and we have our real estate as well as the succession web pages noted here, where a lot of the material we will be talking about today, bits and pieces of it, are posted on these websites in the form of different publications. So we'll do today's presentation is basically 3 parts. We did have several questions we're going to attempt and address either at the end of our presentation today or as we're going through the material. And what you will see is there will be basically 3 sections. The first part, some of the USDA land management highlights, as we like to call them. The USDA has a division called the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And with NASS, they recently published 2021 estimates on county level cash rental rates. I will also be highlighting some of the different farm program payments, disaster payments that were made, kind of what has been paid and what will be paid going forward, or what the estimates are going forward. Second part here, Allan Vyhnalek will be highlighting some different landlord and tenant communication issues. Things related to, as he likes to call it, closing out the leases, what type of information needs to be shared, also considerations for 2022. It's always amazing as we're going along throughout the years how much things vary. Just think back a year ago from now, things were much different related to price and expectations, and it's anyone's guess where we're going to be in the next 6 months. And then in the final part, we'll review questions. And we also have a really good slate. Allan has been working very hard on scheduling land management workshops. And we'll be sure to highlight, we have a pretty good, I think there's almost 18 meetings or something like that. And we'll be starting here in Eastern Nebraska. In January, we'll be in the Panhandle and then be working our way back east. Allan did an excellent job scheduling these. So weather permitting and COVID permitting, we hopefully will be able to get people in person again this year. So let's highlight some of the USDA cash rental rates. First thing to note, the USDA has a division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Survey. They do a county level cash rent survey, and the University of Nebraska is not associated with this survey. We do a separate survey that has separate estimates. But with their survey, you can find the link on the bottom of this screen. You can also find additional information on things like average county corn yields, for example, on this website. But typically, the raw numbers are pushed out towards the end of August, and then they typically, the USDA puts out a nice map that we'll be highlighting here in the next couple of slides that publishes the county level cash rent estimates. And with these estimates, they're usually published the second week of September. And the surveys are usually published in odd numbered years. Now, they did do this survey in 2020, and I anticipate they'll probably be doing it again 2023. I don't have any direction for sure if they'll be conducted in 2022, but nonetheless, we do get a snapshot here of where things are at. I know many people are thinking about cash rents. What should they be? Where should they be headed? Well, sometimes you have to step back and where have you been? How do your numbers on the property you rent or you rent out to someone, how do they stack up against where some of these numbers are? And why is that the case? Remember, everyone's ground is different, and there is no quote unquote average ground. There's every parcel of ground in the state has unique features and attributes related to productivity and whatever else the case might be. Take a brief look here. A few things to note. If you go to the website, once again, the same link that was on the prior slide. If you take a look at this website link, you can actually download the 3-page PDF of this report and make sure credit is due to the USDA with the NAS publication. And a few things to note. This is the dryland county level estimates for the 2021 growing season. If your property is in a county that's in white, there were not enough numbers produced or enough numbers responded to that the average cash rent estimates could be provided for the region. So this is the breakdown that we see right here. Cash rental rates vary significantly, going from starting out in the West Panhandle to the east. Productivity of the land is one feature, but one of the biggest things is probably rainfall as well as soil type. So this is a breakdown of the 2021 dryland cropland rental rates. Some of the highest rates that were reported according to the survey came in Northeast Nebraska and Cumming County, as well as surrounding counties in that region. Lower cash rental rates were in the Panhandle, primarily out in Kimball, as well as Sioux counties, which are out in the extreme western part of the state. Take another look here on irrigated cash rental rates. Once again, if there is a county on this slide that's in white, there were not enough estimates. An example, there's not a lot of irrigated cropland in some of these counties right here, or in other cases, you know, in the southeast corner of the state, there is some, but rainfall is different and the water table is such that we don't see quite as much irrigation. And if you're in some of these other counties, maybe there is irrigation, but maybe there wasn't enough responses provided. With the USDA, they do not divide out the center pivot from the flood or the gravity irrigation. And what I mean by that is if you're in some of these counties along Interstate 80 down here that have a fair amount of flood or gravity irrigation, as you might call it, the numbers produced on this example are for the 2021 weighted average. Okay. For the 2021 rental rates, we have a breakdown here of Cedar County, Dixon County, Wayne County are a little bit on the upper end. Go out into the western part of the state, the stocking rates are significantly different. So be aware of that and keep that in mind. And if anyone has any questions, Allan or I can take some. But once again, this survey is done by the USDA. It's a source of information. It provides an estimate. Okay. All right. I want to give a highlight here. Dr. Brad Lubin is our farm policy specialist here in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And in late October, we had a webinar that highlighted some of the different farm program payments that had been made or maybe projected to be made related to what is called the ag risk coverage or the price loss coverage programs. I want to make sure the credit is given on this. Dr. Lubin did an excellent job on October 21st, 2021. You can actually log in and take a look at this webinar. We do a webinar each Thursday from the department. Topics are all over the board related to farm management and whatever else. But I really want to highlight the fact that you can find archived programs. And with this program, I went in and I took a few snapshots of a few slides. Credit is all given to Dr. Lubin, but I just want to highlight this given the group of individuals we have on today are maybe interested on it. Okay, so related to ag policy issues, Dr. Lubin gave a breakdown on different ag policy issues here for the state of Nebraska. And related to that, we're going to be having a new farm bill in 2023. And with this new farm bill, there will be a lot of different priorities given that we have changing administrations and some of the things that go with that. And right now, the ag sector, especially on the crop side, prices are much higher than they were even a year or two ago. And with that, we're seeing some different concerns being addressed. And obviously, we don't need to get into the politics of things, but obviously there's a lot of different things happening there. And just be aware some of the priorities of the last farm bill might be slightly different with respect to things like trade, food policy, supplemental nutrition assistance programs, energy, climate change, or what people call climate change. These are all different things that may vary. So be aware of them and some of the policies. But right now, under the current Farm Bill, let's take a brief look here. I want to highlight a few things. Now, I'm not going to go into the mechanics of what's actually associated with these programs, but be aware, the majority of land in Nebraska is enrolled in one of two things. One is called the Price Loss Coverage, or the PLC program. The other one is called the Ag Risk Coverage, or the ARC program. With either of these programs, there is a payment made under a certain situation. These payments are typically tied to either price or yield. And with that, just be aware that the price loss coverage program is a price guarantee. So effective relative to the effective reference price, which is a guarantee that's based off the historic base acres associated with the property. The guarantees we have are $370 for corn, $840 for beans, and so on and so forth. And also remember, these prices are related to the marketing year average price. So if there are any payments made, they are made almost the year after the harvest. So if there were any payments made on any farms across Nebraska for the 2020 growing year, they were actually made in, let's say, late September or early October of 2021. I highlighted on red here, you'll take a note that there were basically no PLC payments made for the major crops except for wheat, okay? And this is with respect to your historic base, so please be aware of that. Okay, we'll move over here to the Ag Risk Coverage. Now, the Ag Risk Coverage is a different program. It's based off a county level revenue guarantee, not the farm level, not the state, but the county level. And there's a lot of detail inside of there. The major things to know I want to highlight here. Depending on what county you're in, there's separate guarantees for corn, soybeans, wheat. And if you're in an area where there's enough irrigation, there may in fact be another guarantee for irrigated corn versus dryland corn, or irrigated beans versus dryland soybeans. And that's what Brad noted here in this these different county practice combinations, as he notes. Overall, there were very few payments made. There were a few cases, and I don't know which counties these were exactly, but there were not nearly as many counties as there were a couple of years ago that were receiving payments under this. If you were a county receiving a payment under this, you probably had to have some type of a weather-related event that really disrupted the yield, or in the case of wheat, the disruption of the yield coupled with the lower than anticipated prices. Okay. And the final thing we want to highlight right here, got one more slide, and then we'll give you switching over to Allan here in a moment. When we kind of take a look for payment projections for the 2021 growing year that would be paid out in, say, late September or early October of 2022, be aware that given where current prices are right now, we don't have a very high projection or a very high outlook that we anticipate receiving any PLC payments. And for the yield or the price component of the ARC guarantee to see any substantial payment, we would have to see a very, very high decline in county level yields to see significant payments. Now, the question that's been addressed to us a few times over the last few months is who gets any of the disaster payments coming from the USDA? Well, the simple answer is the operator. The operator is the one that bears production risk. Now, you can be a landlord and still be an operator if you choose to participate in a crop share, not a cash release, but a crop share. Because under a crop share, the landlord is participating in the risk. So just be aware that if there are any disaster payments made and you'd like to participate in some of these programs for ARC, PLC, or other ones, the payments are made in accordance to the lease. So if you're on a 50-50 crop share, the payments would be divided in two. Half would go to the landlord, half would go to the tenant, because each of the two involved would be receiving half of the crop. Kind of the final slide here before we switch over to Allan. Outlook for the Farm Bill. right now, prices, if we would be writing the farm bill today, prices are a lot better than they were, say, a year ago. With that being said, if prices would maintain where they're at or somewhat close to where they're at, we probably wouldn't be seeing a lot of different safety net payments. So we'd probably see a lower national baseline, and that's that first bullet point right there, on payments being made. Now there is ad hoc payments. Ad hoc payments are payments, think of them as the need arises. If you have a substantial issue, disruption because of COVID and livestock had to be put down because there was nowhere to go with them. Well, there are ad hoc programs that pay out support to the producers that had to put down livestock or euthanize because of supply chain disruptions. One of the biggest cornerstones of the farm management portfolio is crop insurance. Now, this is federally subsidized crop insurance, so please be aware of that. But that clearly is the biggest tool that many operators use to manage risk. Now, as we said, there's different priorities right now and different changes, and setting aside our differences we may have on this topic, it appears food assistance and conservation and climate, and also the equity as noted on the third bullet point put together by Dr. Lubin. Those may receive a different priority in this farm bill than what they may have historically have. So we'll have to see what happens there, but this is kind of just from a stepping back and taking a look at where things are at. These might be some of the major things. But once again, Dr. Lubin did an excellent job on October 21st. And please view his webinar recording if you would like to find some additional information. With that, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and we'll have Allan Vyhnalek get started.
Yeah, so don't mute yourself too much, Jim. So the follow-up question that I have for you, because I've gotten this the last 2 weeks, is there was a whole bunch of pandemic-related payments made to farmers. How is that handled in terms of who should have got that money, and how was that divided? And do I change the rent this year for 22 based on the fact that my farmer or my tenant received all this cash? You want to address that specifically as it relates to the pandemic payments?
So, okay. When Allan says pandemic payments, you may have heard of things like the CFAP, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. In the past, there was also one called the Marketing Facilitation Payments, MFP. The party that bears the production risk gets the payment. Okay, so once again, if you're on a crop share, you were on a crop share, you got half the crop, the tenant got the other half, or you got a third or 40%, whatever the number was. The payment would have been paid out in accordance with the proportion of the lease. Now, why are people getting these payments, or why were they paid out? They were paid out because at the time, things were not good. There was a period during the pandemic, I remember the cash price of corn at my local elevator early on in the pandemic, I think it was about around July or so of August of 2020, price of corn was below $3 a bushel. With that being said, these payments were made to offset some of these losses. Now, I am keenly aware there are landlords aware of these payments, and they're trying to figure out how do we set cash rents in 2022. Well, once again, I would not be looking at those specific payments. Those payments were made to offset losses incurred because of the COVID disruption and other things associated with that. I would be looking at potential profitability, and I'd also be looking at input costs tenants are facing, and I believe Allan will get deeper into this. The reason I bring that up, even with 550 corn, we're going to have very high production expenses with seed. Seed is up, but fertilizer is just, maybe Allan can talk on that more, but that's how I would approach it. Payments were made because of bad things that happened to get producers through 2020. We're in a different production cycle. And with that, I would focus on what has not been in the past, but what we need to be thinking about going forward. So that's my view on that.
All right. Thanks, Jim. So as always, I'll talk a little bit about what communication should be going on, especially this time of year as we get into this last quarter. So Jim, go on to the next slide, please. Jim's controlling the slides today, so here we go. So now is a good time, especially as you finish up harvest, to get out there and see what's going on the farm. If you're a landlord, especially, get out there and see what's going on. There may be erosion issues that have to be dealt with. I know that My farm, for instance, received between 5 and 6 inches of rain 1 week. So I was out there last week, took a look at that, and thank goodness there was lots of crop residue left on the ground, and so and it was extraordinarily dry. I mean, the ground was really dry, so a lot of that we did not have severe erosion compared to some years, sometimes. The other thing you'll notice if you go out there right now is that you'll notice little henbit rosettes and other weeds out there, fall weeds that come on, that'll be spring over winter annuals. They'll come on in the spring. And it's not, especially as you hit these 70-degree days today and tomorrow, it's not too late to go and spray that. And it's a cheap, usually 240 will take care of it. Check with your local supplier, but it's a good time to get some of those issues taken care of. And the other thing that happens in the fall is we get some questions sometimes about what happens with yield information. I think that yield information, especially for cash leases, can still be shared. I know that I have a lot of tenants that say, I don't want to tell them what my yield was for my cash lease. That's mine. I paid for the lease. It's a done deal. And that's fine, except that I would encourage you to go ahead and share that information. And if the landowner wants that information, you should share it. And if he doesn't get that information, the landowner should put that request into the next lease. The next lease should say, I get yield information. So, but I have to warn the landowners about something. Farmers, the tenants won't want to give you that information very badly because they're afraid you're going to use it to find the next tenant. You go to your place of socialization, the coffee shop, if you will. You start talking about what yields were, and you'll go, well, wait a minute. You mean you got a farmer that could get better yields than that? So be careful about doing that, because essentially at the end of the day, your soil type may be different. You may have had a different rainfall pattern. It may be a variety of factors that could change yields from one farm to the next, even if they're right across the road from each other, or even right across the fence from each other. So be careful about that. You have to treat the information like yield monitored information from a combine. If the farmer tenant chooses to give it to you, as just like the doctor-patient relationship in a medical field. In other words, that's your information only. It's being shared with you, and it should not be made public to the rest of the neighborhood or the rest of the world. Farmers don't, they resent that. And I understand that they would resent that. That's not an issue for me. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide. As we go through here, please understand if you got questions or if you need something clarified, please type them in the chat, or please type them in that, I think it's called a Q&A box. Who gets to use corn stalks? Corn stalks for that are on a cash lease where the tenant is paid for the use of that ground for an entire year. Unless the corn stalks are held out of the lease, the corn stalks belong to the tenant. And if he uses them for his cattle, that's as it should be. If he's subleasing them to a different person in the neighborhood or whatever, then that's a point of discussion possibly. But to me, on the corn stalk rent deal, whoever's putting up the fence and hauling the water and taking care of stuff like that, those are the people that that's where the money should follow that, because that's the real labor involved, and who's checking cows and that sort of thing. Now, if you have a situation where you're several miles away from where the cattle are at, and there's a local landlord living on the place, and he has a fence up already, and the cattle coming into his yard to drink his water, and he's pumping the water for the cattle. Absolutely, we should have a corn stalk charge, and that landlord should get that charge even if you're subleasing the ground, because it's you who does the work, as you should get paid. But just to know, corn stalks are rent all the way from free. Typical charge be 10, 15, maybe up to $20 an acre if it's charged at all, because like I said, it's sometimes free. And then on the top end, I've heard as high as 45, $50 an acre, but that was in a very specific demand situation where a large dairy in eastern Colorado just had command of all the corn stalks he could get his hands on to make bedding into that. The main thing is, I think that when we're grazing, you should be happy that the corn stalks are getting grazed with cattle, and as long as it's not completely overgrazed, because we're picking up that volunteer corn, and it just creates less wheat problems for next year. And so I think that's a good thing. When I get concerned about corn stalks and that sort of thing is when we're baling them, and we're using pretty aggressive raking or aggressive shredding and raking, where we're making the ground pretty bare. Yeah, then I think we're taking off too much phosphorus. I think we're taking off too much organic matter. And I'm not opposed to baling corn stalks once in a while. I just wouldn't do it off the same place all the time. I would space that out every 4 or 6 years, something like that, to take that corn stalks off of the same farm. Otherwise, we're being too hard on the ability to put that organic matter back into the soil. Okay, go on. Hunting season started last Saturday, and how's that being managed? If it's a cash lease on crop ground, the hunting rights go to the tenant. If it's a pasture, hunting rights typically will stay with the landlord. Why? Because in a pasture lease, a typical pasture lease, especially in eastern Nebraska, is a 5-month lease. The pasture lease goes from May 1st to May 1st to October 1st, or May 15th, October 15th, or even June 1st to November 1st. And so the lease is over. The lease is done. The cattle should be removed by now. And so the landlord keeps the lease for pasture and for waste ground. The tenant has the lease for the farm ground. Of course, there are exceptions, and good communication is needed. And again, if the tenant has the lease, is it okay for them to sublease the hunting rights off to a neighbor? Have that discussion before the lease starts. It's just way cleaner, way better, way more important to do it that way. So there can be exceptions. The main thing is if you let somebody go and hunt there, or use your farm as a recreational activity, it doesn't have to be hunting. It could be horseback riding. It could be running an ATV around. It could be fishing. It could be a variety of recreational activities. Know that if you don't charge, then somebody can't sue you for being liable, because there's a Good Samaritan or a act in Nebraska that protects that recreational use. And protects the landowner for that recreational use. If you're charging for hunting, then you should have a pretty good, go visit with your insurance person and have a good liability policy there, because then they would have the option of maybe trying to file a lawsuit against either the renter, or if it's a tenant, or the landowner, if they think that they have a liability issue, that they've been hurt. So that if there's questions about that, just let me know individually, or to type it to Jim or I. We can both answer that. I'm trying to keep going. Let's go on to the next slide. Manure. So Jim already alluded to this. Fertilizer is going to be really expensive next year. We got to remember, I grew up a long time ago with $150 to $200 per ton anhydrous ammonia. Back in 2006, 2013, anhydrous ammonia jumped to $400, $500, $600 a ton. Well, the current national average, I just saw it this morning, is $1,140 a ton or something like that. And I'm hearing spots in Nebraska where it's $1,500 a ton for anhydrous ammonia. That's even if you can get it. A lot of it's already contracted out for this fall, for fall delivery and application. So I don't even know how much is going to be available, especially next spring. And we're not even getting in some cases, we're not even getting prices on phosphorus fertilizers, because they don't know if it's going to be available, and they don't know what price it's going to be, because they don't even know if they can get it. So I think that the application of manure now becomes more important, because if you're not going to get phosphorus, if you need phosphorus out there, manure is a good source of phosphorus. So the other caution I would give you is be careful about manure. Don't over apply necessarily. Don't put manure out. I wouldn't put manure out every year, because it adds too much phosphorus to the soil. It doesn't get used all that quickly. So be careful about phosphorus. But as long as you're putting it out there every 3rd or 4th year, and you apply according to your phosphorus requirements, manure is an excellent product. I think the only thing you probably have to be careful of with manure, I know some people get excited about it, I don't, is sometimes manure will contain weed seeds. It comes from the hay or forage that's been fed to the cattle or sheep. And so you have to just kind of be careful about that. But in most cases, that's not an issue. That's a minor issue compared to the hysteria you hear about it sometimes. I'll go on to the next slide. Okay. Cash rents considerations for 22. What should happen to cash leases? Well, I've been getting this question a fair amount recently. Actually, I think that what should happen with cash leases, property taxes are level, and I think I got the wrong word there. I think it's probably, actually, in some cases, they're actually starting to go down. Property taxes are level to lower slightly. Input costs are way up. Jim and I just described that. And so we have to be really careful about that, especially on the expense side for the tenant. And so you're going to have to push, everybody's got to push a sharp pencil, evaluate an equitable split on revenue proceeds. And I would encourage people to use, we have a coworker named Glennis McClure here in the Ag Econ department that's put together the Ag Budget Calculator. Just do a search on that, Ag Budget Calculator. From Nebraska, maybe Jim or Ryan can put it in the chat, the link to it, and and let the budget calculator figure out where you're at. Put in some fertilizer costs, put in some seed costs, put in your field operations, and it'll spit out a. Thanks, Ryan. It'll spit out a break even for everybody, and kind of tell you what you got left over and that sort of thing. If there's any proceeds to be left, so just know that. And get a sharp pencil going, or get your pencil out and your calculator out, figure it out. It's an important thing to worry about for next year, what we're going to do with cash rents. I don't know what to recommend. As Jim said earlier, we don't know what's going to happen with prices, and we sure as the world don't know what's going to happen with expenses. To me, it's as uncertain as I've ever felt doing this fall webinar for this land management quarterly series. Okay, next slide. Please have a written lease. There's just really good reasons to have it. It protects both parties. It defines the duties of each party in the contract. It handles unforeseen circumstances. I had an 80-some-year-old guy come up to me once after I did my talk and talked about the importance of a written lease, and he just was going crazy about, by golly, in my generation, we didn't need any written lease because our word was our bond. I said, I respect that, and I know that for your generation that is true. But what happens when you're gone? To me, the scary story was a person about my age, maybe a little younger, had to deal with their mother's estate. Mother was still living; she was in a nursing home. She was deemed incapacitated because of dementia, and so the mother, this lady, the daughter then had to take over handling her business affairs because that's the way she had her power of attorney set up. And she said, I now need to go deal with the tenant for next year. What do? I said, well, you follow whatever the lease said. And she said, that's the problem. There is no lease. And her mother can't tell her anymore because she's incapacitated. And so basically this lady, this daughter, has been on the farm for 40 years, has to go deal with the lease. And I think we put them in a terribly uncomfortable situation. I would never accuse any farmer of not telling them the truth, but we haven't educated that next generation necessarily to be able to do that business for us unless we tell them what's going on. So just understand this. You're not doing a written lease for you. You're doing a written lease for if you're gone tomorrow. So that's the importance of doing a written lease. Okay, go ahead. So if you have a written lease and you see, if you don't have a written lease, you need to get one. Is there some fill in the blank leases that are available at aglease101.org, and they're free PDFs that you fill in, and you won't use it. They're pretty detailed. You won't use it all, but you'll use what you need, and it works out very well. On this main site, aglease101.org, click on the document library. Click on it. Go ahead to the next slide, Jim. And once you get to the document library, then there's fillable forms there of different things you can get. And publications are on the left, and the fillable forms are on the right. And so, for instance, if you have a cash farm lease, you use the upper right file. If you have a crop share lease, you use the second one down on the right side. But that sort of thing. The only thing Jim and I like to point out on this page is that the people we get asked several times a year, 4, 5, 6 times a year, what's the going rate for a machinery storage shed on the farm? There's an old, there's a shed out there that could be used. What do I do for storage rental? And you look in the lower left-hand corner, it says Farm Building Rental Rate Survey. And I realize when you pull that up, it'll be old data, but it's the only data we have. Nobody's done a survey on it for 10 years, basically. So I don't know what you would add to that, but I don't think you'd have to add some kind of a that sort of thing. Okay, flex leases, yeah. So our flex leases being used. I think Jim would have to answer that precisely, but I think that they've been used in 6 to 8% of this. His last survey says about 6 to 8% of the leases are flex leases, and Jim can address that more here in a minute when we get to the questions. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, here we go. Here's the question and answer side. So if you have a question, type it in the chat. We got a couple that were submitted ahead of time, so I'm going to cover them right now, and Jim's going to cover one right now, and then we'll get to your questions that you have as we go through this. And we're, wow, really good shape on time, so we'll be able to answer everyone's questions today, I'm sure. Okay, the question was, I own land and it was contacted by my crop share tenants on a verbal lease, and they want to terminate the lease. Is that allowed? Technically, no. Lease termination by either party has to be received by September 1st, not on September 1st, but before. So for 22, you had to let everybody know that the lease was invalid by September 1st, 21. However, that's the legal answer. To be honest, if you have a lease and both parties are willing to terminate the lease, you can terminate it anytime you want to. However, both parties have to be willing. If one party's not willing to terminate the lease, then obviously you would follow the September 1st rule. And so this person followed up by asking, what do I do now? You would have legal recourse. You could take that tenant to court for not farming your ground, but given the demand for the farm ground to lease, you just need to interview a farmer and get your lease switched over to a new farmer. Let them out of their lease because they're probably not going to do a good job for you anyway. And you make sure you get your next lease in writing, or make sure that it continues in writing if that's the situation. I think that's covered pretty well. Okay, let's go on to the next question. I own 880 and only 78 acres of tillable. 2 acres lost to roadway and ditches. Should I charge cash rent on 78 or 80 acres? Okay. In a crop, if you were doing let's go back to a crop share. If you were doing a crop share lease and you have 78 tillable acres, guess how many acres you're going to get income from? Your 50-50 or 40-60 or whatever the division is. You're going to get income off of 78 acres. That's a crop share lease. So to me, a cash lease should be kind of treated the same way. If I got 78 tillable acres, you would typically charge the lease off of 78 tillable acres. You're not going to charge it off of 80. You don't have 80. You have 78. So I'm sorry, you're going to get taken advantage of for 2 acres on land taxes, but land taxes on 2 acres is probably $200 or a little bit less. So it's in eastern Nebraska. So it should, just have to understand that's what's going to happen. So I think that covers that. I think, Jim, you got a question that was submitted ahead of time.
Yeah. So final question we have right here. If I have a 50-50 crop share lease, so that means the landlord gets half the crop, tenant gets the other half. How are the major input expenses divided between the landlord and the tenant? So the major inputs or major expenses associated with crop share, things like fertilizer, seed, chemicals. In the case if you have irrigation, you would also include some type of energy, say diesel or electricity, or maybe even natural gas or propane. Typically speaking, under a 50-50 split, the major inputs that I just noted, the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses, would be divided in proportion to the lease, or the landlord would pay half and tenant would pay the other half. When it comes to the energy expense, you would divide that accordingly. And the other thing that you are not required, but many folks do take out, are crop insurance policies. Now, when it comes to crop insurance and a crop share, the landlord will maintain their own separate policy, then the tenant will maintain their own separate policy. If the tenant does not want to take out a crop insurance policy, but the landlord does, my understanding is you can do that. Or if the tenant wants to take out a crop insurance policy and the tenant does not, or the landlord does not and the tenant does, you can do it that way. You are only insuring your portion of the crop, okay? So just be aware that's typically how we divide that expense. And before we get people dropping off, I'll come back to the questions, but I want to highlight a few things here. We have, I think, a star-studded list of meetings coming up, and our farmland management meeting series that Allan and I and other people across the state will be helping out with. We're going to kick it off December 1 at the Lancaster County Extension Office. I believe there's going to be a sponsored lunch that day from a local real estate company. And also when we go on, we're going to see that we're going to kind of work our way across mainly the eastern part in December. January, we will be starting out in the western part, moving accordingly. And then in February, we'll be kind of wrapping everything up. And with that, we will, if you want to attend any of these meetings, the only thing we ask is that you call in, provide a name or phone number, email address. Make sure we have enough people registered that if they would like to attend, we can justify sending representatives from the university out, and it's worth everyone's time. Ryan Evans just shared a link to the land management workshop with the name of the program. Be sure to take a look at it and call the local extension office if you'd like. With that, I think we're going to go back to the questions. And I'm sure, Allan, why don't you take a couple and I'll go ahead.
Let me do the ones in the chat. Okay, well, the first one at least. Okay, the first question in chat said that the producer shared yield information. The tenant should explain the costs associated with these yields. The owner should have a complete picture, not just the yields. I would tend to agree with that. Absolutely. If you were paying $400 or $600 a ton for anhydrous and now it's $1,200 a ton, I think the tenant should know that, and the landlord should know that, and then need to know how that changes your break even. Absolutely. Okay, so another one here. Is there any legitimate reason for input companies to be raising the prices? You probably have to ask them. Are we being gouged because they can do it? Again, you have to ask the company. My understanding, Jim, is that there's kind of a shortage of natural gas now all of a sudden. For years we've had a surplus, it seems like. So I'm not sure where we're at with that, but we'd have to ask somebody. To me, somebody needs to investigate that, but I'm not in a position to make that call.
When it comes to price gouging or the high prices, you have to understand there's a lot of disruptions, just not in your daily products like food or other items that you use in your day for daily necessities. There's a lot of issues right now with getting things from where they were grown or developed or produced or manufactured to the end user. And there's different things in the news, and Allan made his comment on there as well. Just be aware it's going to take good communication with the landlord and tenant this upcoming growing season to make prudent decisions. And I don't know what the best strategy it is when it comes to pricing, but just be aware there's different options that are out there. And it takes a lot of good communication to understand what things are at. There was a follow-up question to the question that Allan started off with. Who's gouging who? Well, the question that was asked by someone was, are the input companies pricing or gouging people using different inputs for crops or whatever? I would say no. I would say the bigger thing is probably there's been a very big disruption in the supply chains, and also the cost of producing things is growing exponentially. Just basic things you need to manufacture is steel. I understand we're not buying steel to use out on our land, but cost of labor, drive around any town of any size, it seems like starting wages are anywhere from 15 to 20 bucks an hour now. They still can't find people at that rate. So there's a lot of things going on. All right, I'll take another question here, and then we'll maybe have Allan jump back on and answer one of the first one in the Q&A. How can, another question that came in, how can crop insurance be played into the rent negotiations? How do you factor in crop insurance into cash rent? Or how do you factor it into a crop share even? Well, when we talk about crop shares or cash leases, there is differences in how we manage those, and especially on a cash lease, a tenant would know where they could insure their guarantee at. And what I mean by that is you have a historic set of information related to the production with that property, how many bushels per acre. You'll have a planting time price guarantee. And we can look at some of these things in addition to the inputs to know where, where can we find this stuff? So that's, how should I say it? If we know where our guarantee is, we can hopefully have an open line of communication to talk about where production expenses are at, possibly where guarantees might be, as well as current cash rental rates. Okay, Al, I don't see your video on, but I'm assuming you're still on. Do you want to take that first question in the Q&A on custom application fees?
Sure, absolutely. And then Ryan just posted for Carol, and Ryan just posted the NAS the article you did about the NAS survey results, and it has the maps at the bottom of that article. So that's pretty well done. Who pays for custom application fees? Example: tenant historically applied fertilizer and herbicide with his equipment, but now hires it done by the co-op. Is this a cash rent or is this a crop share? If it's a cash rent, then that's the tenant's expense. If it's a crop share, then you probably just should negotiate that before it gets switched over. For instance, the farm that I own, I used to have on crop share forever and ever and ever, over 20 years with my brother. And when he had the co-op start applying the herbicide, for instance, I did go ahead and pay my percentage of that application fee, mostly because I thought that the co-op, being the trained individuals, would do a better job of applying the herbicide, and I wanted good weed control. So I didn't mind. I just didn't mind doing it that way because, but every part of the world's different. Every neighborhood's different, especially with crop shares. The neighborhoods are different. And so in some cases, the application fee is covered by the tenant. In some cases, it's not. The landlord shares in that. And check around with some other people in your neighborhood and kind of do it according to your neighborhood rules. That's the best. I don't have a textbook on this. I don't have a research study on this. I'm just telling you that's the best advice I can give you. Two of our tenants did not control weeds on the land we owned in 2021. They were trying to save money. I assume we would add weed control to the 2022 lease. Sure, you can add anything you want to a lease. But I think maybe the conversation ought to be what this is unacceptable. And what are your plans to change that for next year? Or do we have to find a different tenant that's willing to do that? I think that's probably the best response. I mean, you could put it in the lease. Obviously, I'm not saying not to. I'm just saying you can put it in the lease. It's okay to do that. But I think the conversation is more important than having it as a lease term.
And that question brings up a good learning point. Let's call it that way. Obviously, prices or the expectations for prices right now, possibly going into 2021, are much better than they were a year ago, right, Al? But the big thing is input expenses. Even before prices took off for seed or took off for the price of the quantities we raise, input expenses, especially with the different types of spray to effectively control different, I'm assuming, different types of broadleaves and soybeans. We had a extension educator in one of our major cropping counties made a comment to me that when they were working on a couple budgets, they couldn't put a soybean budget together with the cost of their herbicides of less than $100 an acre the one year. And it was because of that issues of weeds are resistant to various types of chemicals. There's only so much money to go around when you talk about the total revenue. And if you're trying to account for what's best for the land, some people are after the top cash rent. I would say I would be after what is the best thing you can be doing for the land while maintaining a respectable cash rent for both parties involved. And I think we're going to see this upcoming year is that there's going to be a lot of challenges that are going to be facing us with respect to input expenses. Drought, I have no idea where we're going to be at with that. Obviously, it got dry this past summer, but I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. So with that, we're right at about 12:50 right now.
Jim, I have a question. Did you want to say anything else about the flex or any flex leases being used? I kind of started an answer for that, but I didn't let you finish, and you're probably the better expert to talk about that.
Before we get off, I want to highlight, and I will answer that question now. Next upcoming webinar, 2022. I'm still not used to saying 2022, but February 14th, 2022. We have our outline right here. We'll be taking a deeper look into cash rents. How do we account for maybe adding some dimension of a flex into the cash rent? Updating our ag leases for the 2022 season will be Allan's section. And once again, we really do encourage you to submit questions beforehand. Gives us a little bit of time to think about and maybe things that we need to point out better. On the topic of flex leases, we tend to see flex leases at a much higher rate in areas of the state that are typically row crop producing. So in the eastern third, portions of the state along the central, southern, and southwest, and areas of the state where it's maybe more small grain country, not nearly as much, but in a way, a crop share is the old-fashioned flex lease. Flex leases on irrigated, dryland ground. I personally think when you talk about flex leases, I really like the flexes that are based off the crop revenue, just not yield or price. You can have a really good price, but not necessarily good yield or vice versa. So just be aware of that. And we had a final question I think we'll address here. On share rent, is fuel for farming? Okay, fuel could be things like cutting corn stalks, planting, spraying, harvesting, other operations associated with producing that crop. Typically, how is that split? Well, you know, a year ago or 2 years or a year and a half ago when COVID first outbroke, I remember the price of fuel was much, much lower than it is now. And I'm sure this question is being brought forward just given the cost of energy, diesel, gasoline, whatever, is clearly higher than it was a year ago. When I say when you look at a crop share, think of a scale. And when I say think of a scale, think of what each party is contributing and how are each party taking care of expenses. Okay, so we talked about the division of seed, fertilizer, chemicals, energy associated with operating the irrigation system. If you divide those and you take what is left over for the land tenant, okay, the land tenant has their time, use of the equipment, and the fuel. Landlord is providing the land, plus they have to pay the property taxes. How does that scale balance out? If that crop share is not being equitable and it's slanted way in one party's favor or the other one, maybe this upcoming year, there's nothing set in stone that you cannot negotiate the division of diesel expenses. And maybe that's an expense that you might consider adjusting, or maybe the tenant gets a slightly higher share of the lease because of the higher diesel expenses. And once again, that's an expense that we may not be thinking about because, like I said, you know, the price of diesel is $1.60 versus say $3.60 or $3.25 or $2.80. There's a big difference there. So that's how I would analyze that. Al, do you have anything else you'd like to add on that question or anything else as we wrap up here?
Jim's absolutely right. I think that you need to kind of do that balancing of the scale. I understand that. But, you know, to answer your question specifically, in a typical crop share, field operations are covered by the tenant, and that includes fuel. The fuel that the landlord would typically pay for in a regular crop share would be the irrigation fuel or the electricity for the pumping part of that thing. Here's another question that came in and said, are you ignoring competition and setting rental rates? Jim has to answer that. There is intense competition. We recognize that, but Jim, you can go now.
So the question's kind of getting at the core of maybe what we do with our survey or what the USDA does. We evaluate every survey response that comes in. Any kind of outliers, whether it's exceedingly low or exceedingly high, will be thrown out. But I would anticipate, yes, it'll be a very competitive year coming up, just given the prices of where the crops are. And we talk about in our prior reports, it's an idea, it's called cash equivalent from crop share or from prior presentations. The idea being, hey, if you were on a crop share, look at this from the perspective of a landlord or the perspective of a tenant that's trying to offer a landlord a competitive cash rental rate. What would the landlord stand to make from a crop share? Depending on what that number is, that might be in a rough area where the operator would be willing to offer the cash rent. Start playing around with the numbers, you have to acknowledge the input expenses. If you have a very nice parcel of ground that's very competitive because it raises great yields or whatever, truly, what is the cost of production? The more I think about this, you know, Glennis McClure, with some of her webinar and outreach, she does an excellent job highlighting some of our budgets, but also the ag budget calculator. She's more than happy to talk to anyone about that tool. Is always looking for people to participate in using it, keep building it, keep getting it better. We have a programmer on staff right now that's helping maintain that. And always looking for ways to improve it, make it a little bit easier to understand. And, how can we serve the public better? So be sure to be engaged on some of that. And that might be a good tool to take a look at when you're negotiating rents. So, okay, with that, Al, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. We've reminded everyone on the February 14th webinar. Also, we have our in-person events scheduled for this winter, and these are just a small subset of our meetings. In addition to this, we'll have different marketing. Allan has various succession transition programs going on. We have livestock risk management outreach meetings scheduled. There's a lot of different things, so please keep that in mind. But with that, all right, I'll give one more question. We have 4 minutes. How about I read the question now and you get to answer it?
I'll try.
With cash rents, if changing land with tenants, I assume, should you have a third party soil test the land to establish basically a baseline of fertility? And then let's say, I'll elaborate on this question. Okay, so you're bringing a new tenant onto a parcel of ground. Should you test all your ground to gain an understanding of where productivity is? And let's say 3, 4, 5 years from now, you take on someone else. How do you handle that situation when it comes to that? And if the property that the tenant is vacating is not in alignment with where the current fertility is, how do you deal with that, Al? So does that make sense?
So I've talked about this in some of the workshops, and I'm sure I'll cover it again this winter. The bottom line is, we can have a situation where the tenant will mine, especially phosphorus, because you can take some phosphorus away and still get good yields for a while. But once it gets below that minimum amount, it's like 20 or 25 parts per million phosphorus, then your yields are starting to be affected. So you can mine phosphorus, but I think that getting a soil test when the tenant takes over and giving a soil test every 3rd or 4th year is an excellent idea. But I think that if you're doing that to a tenant, then the landlord better be willing to pay for the soil test. So just keep that in mind, first of all. And also, when a tenant vacates a lease, especially a cash lease, make sure that soil tests are taken and that it's in the cash lease as a provision. It says if it's below a certain level, and you guys have to kind of agree to that ahead of time, to both parties, then the tenant will either put the phosphorus out there or give the landlord money to put phosphorus out there. And the landlord can't just pocket that money. They need to go put phosphorus out there. So I think it's a good idea to retest, whether you're keeping the same tenant or not. And so they're not just mining. And I think it's a good idea to have a thing in your lease that says there will be a reimbursement or a charge to put that back out there, put that phosphorus back out there so it stays. And so it's available for the new tenant. So I think I answered that question as best as I could. With new contracts starting March 22, are these informational meetings behind the game? It depends. In some cases, people don't negotiate until February. So we're not, in that case, we're not late. In some cases, people like to negotiate back in August before September 1st. And we had some meetings back then. And in some cases, people like to negotiate right now before they go south for the winter, before they head down to Arizona or California or wherever they go, South Texas. And they'll negotiate here in November. So depends. I think the idea is we're just trying to get the information out to people, and they'll use it as they can to affect those contracts whenever they come back up again. But quite honestly, if you get information about how to improve your lease, either as a tenant or as a landlord, you should have a conversation with the other party, and whatever you guys agree to is more important than anything written down on the lease. And then you can change that written lease for the next year to make sure you cover it. So anyway.
And I'll add a few things. One reason we do our quarterly webinars is because of people that maybe are doing leases. If maybe they sign a lease and starting the September 1 or whatever. So that's one way to fill in the holes. The other thing is these leases, we're trying to maximize the number of people that we can reach. And if you'd start doing meetings in, say, September, October, you kind of alienate the ability of operators that are very busy at that time. So that's one reason we schedule them when we do. And the other thing is, even if you do have your lease in place for 2022, good for you. I'm glad that you got that taken care of. The but I will throw in is think of a lease as a thing that I understand it's an annual basis, but it's a continual document that you can always improve. And if you do know where your cash rents are you're getting, how do those stack up against some of the regional or county averages? Why are there those differences? Did you pick up anything from Allan's discussion on how do you handle a lease? that, hey, I need to take a note down now and improve my lease going forward. That's, look at it as a continual improvement, just not a one step back regression where you don't, it's always moving forward, keeping track. I always challenge people when I talk to them, especially when they get picked up having to deal with a farm lease after an estate or something. Have a binder with all your stuff in it. Educational materials, lease forms, research, who you talk to, all that. Imagine a binder that you could hand off to Allan or whoever. They could step in and manage that, even if they don't have any current knowledge on it. But with that, we're right at 1 o'clock on my end. So I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting here. We had a great group of people join us today. Glad to see a few of those names on there that I've met in the past, and hopefully we get to meet some of these in the future. If you enjoy these webinars, be sure to find Allan or I at a meeting near you and introduce yourself and tell us what we can do better on them. We're always looking to improve as well. So with that, Al, do you have anything else?
No, thanks everybody for being on. It's a great crowd today. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everyone, and thanks, Al and Ryan.